Awesome. Okay, so I think the stream is a little bit behind. I think I'm going to make probably, um, so before we actually begin, I want to talk about the fact that this stream will probably be something that I'll do on a bi-weekly basis. I think I want to do it in such a way that I just want to answer any kind of questions that a lot of students have been asking me either in private or just messaging me about kind of non-technical questions and more so about success in their careers, figuring out more soft skill related things or some high level non-technical questions. Yes, so definitely the first thing I'm absolutely going to talk about is what I've listed here. So I don't know if anybody can see this. If you guys can see this board, these are going to be the topics that I'm going to cover, especially regarding getting your first job, all of the nuances related to this topic, as well as the differences in the kind of companies that you'll apply for. How do you actually get your foot in the door and make sure that these companies are able to respond to you? And then when you get the job, what does it mean to succeed? What is that scenario going to look like? So the first thing that I want to talk about is definitely going to be getting your first job. Now, for a lot of students and for myself as well, when I first came into this industry, I had no technical experience. I didn't even have a computer science background. I actually have a degree in philosophy and political science. In order for you to get that foot in the door, you have to understand that you're coming in from the perspective of somebody who is really just trying to prove that they're willing to learn. Now, there is going to be, actually, just a quick side note. If my stream cuts out at any point, I'll jump right back on right away. I think there is a little bit of a Wi-Fi issue that I'm having, but I'll jump right back in. So regarding this with the first job, when you first join and start applying to companies, you are going to have to expect a lot of declines. In fact, many people are just not going to want to give you the interview because what they're looking for is dependent on the company. So, for example, there are three main types of companies out there. There are startups, there are enterprise companies, and then there are FAANG companies. So when I say startups, I'm talking about small, very small tech companies that generally you'll find them working out of working spaces or they're working out of maybe somebody's house. The idea is that these companies are very lean. They have an idea about a business that they want to build and they're just getting started. Maybe they're funded by family and friends. Maybe it's funded themselves. Whatever it is a small tech company that is just looking to enter into a market and try and figure out whether or not they can even compete in this market. These type of companies are looking for people that are willing to hustle really hard. You don't have to be that technically talented here because generally speaking, these startup companies are not able to hire intermediate or seniors because they just don't have the money to hire them, nor do they offer enough growth opportunity in the sense that for an intermediate who's maybe trying to get to a senior, the kind of problems that they'll solve are very based on what the market demands them to do in this company. These are the kind of companies that are very easy, or at least easier. I don't want to say very easy, but it's much easier for you to get into a startup than it is for you to get into the next enterprise or FAANG companies, because they're looking for anyone that can demonstrate that they have maybe even a different perspective than just being technically talented, but they are also looking for you to show that you have this tenacity, this willingness to learn. You don't necessarily need the computer science degree in order to show those things at all. If you're able just to convince the person who is often going to be probably the boss, like the CEO who started this little startup, that you have the ambition to get in and contribute and just like figure it out, then chances are they'll take you on because for those companies, they understand what they're getting. Now, how that workplace culture might end up is a completely different thing. We'll talk about that later on, but startups is a great place to start when you have no CS degree, you don't have that much live technical experience, but you have a lot of ambition, you have a lot of tenacity, and you're just trying to convince them that you have those things. Some startups will look for you to have more technical skills. These technical skills with the startups is because the startups vary a lot. Some startups are very accomplished startups in the sense that they might be like at 30 people, 50 people, 100 people, and are still considered startup. Those startups might also have been founded by people that have already succeeded earlier on, and they have a larger network and a lot more reputation. So they're able to bring in more technically talented people, and they have more demand for that. But honestly, when it comes to that first job, you're really just trying to get your foot in the door. So you might just want to apply for all the startups. Any startup, you should take a crack at it. Because really with this application thing, it's really just a big numbers game. By technical, I mean actual coding, like product coding. Data structures algorithms are really only for FAANG and enterprise companies. They're really more so tech-first companies. Now, where do you find these startups? A lot of the times they'll be online in your local region in different startup-related blogs. You may have to figure out where those are, but generally speaking, they're always looking to hire, so they're pushing through any of these channels that they can get into. With these type of startups, they also tend to go to like tech-related career fairs. So that's where you'll go and you'll maybe see a little booth for a company that's maybe like 10 people strong and they're looking to hire another junior developer. Now, with those startups, however, the only thing to keep in mind is that they have a very, I want to say varied interview process because they themselves might be working on a slew of different legacy code or specific types of, maybe they're looking for to build a new React app. Maybe they're looking to build a new Angular app. It's very varied. So you actually don't really know what you're going to be asked during the interview, but I'm going to cover some common cases that you'll probably see later on during this HR process section of the stream. So after startups, there's enterprise. Enterprise is anything from banks to like large agencies, kind of like a Deloitte or like KPMG, right, where they have like a digital section. Or you could be working in like telecommunications. It's essentially these big, massive international companies that have a digital sector. These companies tend to have a bit more of a requirement from where you're coming from. That's not to say that you cannot get a job with them if you don't have a CS degree or if you have no technical experience. Technical experience being experience coding on like a live website or a website in production. But for these companies, they are pretty well known. They have a bit of a footprint amongst the general population, so they get quite a decent amount of applications. For them, it's a little bit easier as long as you know somebody in the company. If somebody's in the company or you're able to reach out to the hiring manager on LinkedIn, figure out some emails, and just email them and say you want to work at the company, there is a chance that they will respond back because generally speaking, amongst most developers in the tech industry, they don't want to work for an enterprise company. Especially when you work in a much more modern tech company. Enterprise companies tend to have a much slower process. They tend to be much older in the code base that they're using. And usually speaking, though, they have a very specific interview process. Now, enterprise also captures a lot of the much larger tech companies because when I say enterprise, I'm still talking about like Microsoft, I'm talking about Amazon, right? They're enterprise in the sense that they're massive, massive entities. But they kind of bleed into this next category, which is FAANG. So before I move on to FAANG, the main takeaway for enterprise is that enterprise is worth applying to. You might see much more stringent details in what they require of you when you're applying. So maybe they'll want you to have like a computer science degree, or maybe they'll want you to have 2 years experience, and they may be a little bit less flexible on that, but still apply. Because the big thing about these companies is that they're trying to fill roles. They're organized by departments, and those departments get a certain amount of money every quarter or every year to hire, and they have to hit that quota. Because of the way that the enterprise is set up, it's much more top down. There's a lot of micro, small organizations, and they all have to report up, which means that the HR department must be able to fill a role to hire somebody. So a lot of what that means is that it comes down to timing. You might just happen to apply to the company when it must fill a role, meaning that they'll be looser on what requirements they look for in a candidate before moving them on. And generally speaking, enterprise was very willing to hire juniors because they themselves don't really know fully what they're looking for. If you have experience in their legacy code base, that's great, but it's rare that you'll find a lot of developers that are new and can fill that role. And the thing too with enterprise is that while they have a lot of money, they tend to be quite cheap with their salary. Not to say that you won't get paid like pretty well for your first job. In fact, sometimes the enterprise will often pay better than the startup. The only thing is that the enterprise is not really going to give you that much flexibility in terms of how much money you'll make after working there a year or 2 years. The raises tend to be much more structured and rigid. The other thing as well is that getting a job in the enterprise, if you happen to hit that, you get a lucky break and they're looking to hire somebody who's, maybe doesn't meet the requirements, then in that case, you'll get in and at the very least, you have your foot in the door, right? That first job is by far the hardest one to crack. The first job is the only one that kind of shows that you're not really proven yet. And it's not to say that you're any worse than somebody that has a year of experience. It's just to say that these companies are not necessarily ready, to take you on, right? Because a lot of companies just need to know that you've at least worked in a team setting before, but it's really just a signaling thing, meaning that it's really just they are trying to see, right? It's just another way that they can bucket you in or out of different categories. But we'll talk about this a little more later as well. The last one is FAANG. So this is where most people are the most interested, right? So a FAANG company, FAANG stands for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. And this kind of captures all of the big tech companies that you see inside of Silicon Valley, inside of San Francisco. Any of those big, kind of top of the tech company pushing innovation forward, very tech forward companies, these companies have a very, very strict process in how they even take on juniors. They hire juniors, but their caliber of junior is very high. A lot of the time, some people that might be seniors in enterprise or startups can't even get in as a junior to FAANG companies because the expectation is there that you are supposed to be the best of the best. Because for these companies, they are already at that peak. Everyone wants to go there because they pay the best, they have the best workplace culture, their process is efficient, they have excellent benefits. They are phenomenal companies to work for, absolutely incredible companies to work for, and the growth that you experience in them is astronomical. The only thing is that getting in there is going to be extremely difficult. So they want you to have the academic experience regardless of whether or not you'll even do it on the job. And when I say academic experience, I don't mean necessarily that you have to have a computer science degree in order to get a job here. It mostly means that you have to be able to do the things that somebody who has a degree might have learned. And these are data structures and algorithms. The interview process for FAANG is very, very, very rigid. It's very extremely difficult, and a lot of the times it requires people to spend a lot of time reading and learning this stuff. So when it comes to the FAANG companies, the process for interviewing and even getting the interview is that you probably have to have, or you should know somebody who can refer you into the company. It's very rare that the company will even take a look at you if nobody has vetted you before inside. Now, a lot of the time, some of these FAANG companies will have automated systems that will just push you out if you're not even coming in through referral. I think there are some numbers that say that it's roughly 3% organic, meaning that if you just apply to them, you have a 3% chance that you'll really get even the first interview. So a lot of the times with these companies, they're really looking for people that have a couple years of experience already, and then that way, at the very least, they're just looking for that kind of situation. Now, that's not to say that you cannot get this as your first job. I have heard of a lot of cases of some of the students in ZTM or some of my colleagues who were just coming out of a boot camp or something and got into one of these FAANG companies. But oftentimes what they've done is they've established something that stands out in their resume. So maybe they have a very popular tech blog, or maybe they contribute a lot to open source. The main idea is that they've done a lot that proves to these companies that they're not average. The big thing with FAANG is that they want to see that you're not average. If you are doing stuff that a lot of people are expecting you to do, like, have a website, worked on some projects, it's just not enough for these companies. They just want to see that you've done some stuff. Yeah, FAANG, sorry, I should probably clarify early in the stream. FAANG stands for Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, and the second A is Amazon. So with this in mind, FAANG we're also going to talk about it though. We'll talk about how to get into FAANG as well, because even though it might not be your first job, it's definitely worth considering and figuring out how to get into. Now that you have an idea kind of what these companies are, before we talk about this, right, how do I know I'm ready? Let's break this down. So coming into the industry is extremely nerve-wracking. Extremely nerve-wracking. It's scary because you are not really sure whether or not you even have enough knowledge to even approach the interview. I totally know that feeling because I was there myself. But what everybody will tell you is that the best way to do it is honestly just to apply to a lot of jobs, because at the very least, if you don't really know, if you approach an interview and you apply, and maybe you apply to 300 of them, and you get like 3 callbacks for the first interview, after the first 2, you'll at least have an idea of what you don't know. And then for the third one, you're a little bit more prepared. Now, let's say you only get 1 interview, right? Either way, you have more exposure to what they are expecting when you have 0 knowledge. Keeping that in mind, the other thing to think about when applying and knowing when you're ready is that, technically speaking, for a long time, you're never really going to feel ready. A lot of it is just calming that voice inside, because the companies that are looking for juniors and are willing to give you a shot are going to know where you're coming from, or they should at least. They should know that they're going to look at you and see that you don't really have the technical experience. You might not have the degree, but at the very least, they know that you have the ambition. Maybe they know that you have the willingness to learn. And the way that you can prove that in the initial interview, if they ask, is you try and come up with kind of like stories of what you've learned. And a lot of it will just be about selling yourself and telling a story of some of the friction and the problems you faced while learning a new technology. So for example, any kind of insights that you've learned from any of my courses or Andre's courses, you can explain to them as something that you might have learned through the tutorial, but it's something that you've learned that you didn't know before. At the very least, this shows that you have an understanding, and it gives you a chance to kind of demonstrate that you know something in the industry. Because for them, they have no idea how much you know. They have no idea how much of the React or how much JavaScript you know. So if you're even just able to demonstrate that you've learned something about event handlers, you've learned something about the re-rendering process, you understand what Redux does when it comes to state, the benefits, if you can squeeze that in the conversation, that at least demonstrates some knowledge, which may help you in that process. Now, keeping that in mind, honestly, when it comes to how do you know if you're ready, you never really will. It's just a matter of applying, getting some feedback, and reapplying. And this application process is a big, big numbers game. It's just about applying to as many companies as you can and figuring out whether or not you're able to speak to the person that is making the decision. So in a startup, the person that makes the decision is probably going to be everybody, right? Because the company is small. It's like 8 people. Chances are all of them are going to be looking for new, interested candidates because everybody has the obligation to try and bring somebody into the team. If you can speak to the CEO or the CTO, it's much better, but it's also very easy to meet them because the company's small, and a lot of times at the startup, the C-level owners are going to be the people that are going to these events and trying to bring people into the company. Now, when it comes to enterprise, honestly, with enterprise, you shouldn't really worry about whether or not you feel ready with enterprise. You just have to figure out kind of what it is that their stack is. So when you talk to enterprise, there's always a recruiter. It's very rare that you'll just speak right to the hiring manager. With enterprise companies, you'll speak to a recruiter, and the recruiter will give you an idea of what their tech stack looks like. They give the same kind of pitch to everyone, every candidate. And with them, you pretty much are just trying to understand what stack they use and understand what steps they have inside of their interview process. And then as for FAANG, with FAANG, as I mentioned, with FAANG, honestly, how do I know I'm ready? You need to have done a lot of prep. FAANG is the only one where the amount of prep required is very, very large. You have to be very comfortable with data structures and algorithm type questions. So when it comes to that, maybe you do something like HackerRank, LeetCode, Exorcism. There's all these different websites that comes down to learning how to interview for FAANG companies. There's the book Cracking the Coding Interview. They all the process of detailing what a FAANG interview will be is quite extensive online. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this interview. This interview is really, really hard, and they are only kind of getting harder. The type of questions that are being seen now are way more difficult than they were about a year ago. So make sure that if you're going to interview for FAANG, you do the prep for it. And the prep is long. You have to set aside a lot of time because the companies almost expect you to. Now, keeping this in mind, let's talk about the HR process. This is going to encapsulate what it's like on the inside of the company, as well as your resume. With your resume, if you don't have a lot to show on your GitHub, at the very least try and show that you have some overlap in terms of, I want to say skills, with the company that you're applying for. With a lot of these type of companies, like startups, for example, startups tend to be in any variety of industries. If you're applying for a startup that is in fintech, if you can show that you have any kind of experience in finance at all, that's useful for them because they're looking for people that kind of have perspective as well. They're looking for people to wear multiple different hats, not just like the developer hat. They want people that are able to maybe help them figure out things about their product, help them figure out things about their design. You want to leverage any little information that you have to be able to contribute. For me, for example, I have a philosophy and political science degree, and before I became a developer, I was an owner of a gym. So with that in mind, when I applied for startups, I kind of showed that I knew how business works, especially at a small scale, because I was a small-time business owner in a completely unrelated field. And then with political science and philosophy as my degree, I mostly tried to communicate that I was good at communication, but I was also good at understanding problems that were not necessarily technical. was able to analyze things strategically, and you really just have to try and demonstrate or just directly say that in the interview. The interview is really a way for you to sell yourself. So with startups, that's the main thing. You got to sell yourself. You got to sell yourself. If you don't have technical things, just sell yourself on the non-technical things. As far as your resume goes, if you don't have much experience, there's nothing you can really do about it. You just got to hope that it's interesting enough that they are intrigued by your resume. And when I say interesting, honestly, this could be anything. That's the thing. Resumes are meant to kind of make an impression, and I'm talking purely at the startup level, because chances are they're not running any kind of software. People are probably reading every single resume. They're going through the stacks of resumes, and if yours stands out in any way, then that's a good thing. For enterprise, though, chances are with enterprise, the resumes are going to be required to be more specific. But every enterprise might be a little different. That's not to say that they're all going to filter out if you don't have a CS degree or you don't have any technical experience. But maybe with the enterprise, there's a couple nuances that maybe some of the recruiters or the hiring managers are looking at the resumes. And again, as long as you are able to stand out in any way, that's a benefit. The main thing is you want to stand out in the beginning here as much as you can. Now, with FAANG is a little bit more difficult because with the resume for FAANG, they want to see that you have experience that overlaps with one of the teams that they're hiring for. So FAANG is like enterprise in the sense that they're also very large and organizational, and they also need to fill roles in teams. The problem is going to be just that they need much more overlap in terms of skill. FAANG companies hire less on promise. They hire less on what's the word? It's escaping me at the moment. Potential. They're not really looking for people with a lot of potential. They're looking for experts. Even when you're new, they're still looking for people that are kind of in that top 1%, even amongst juniors. So this is the thing. Now, that's not to say that you can't get there. You just have to do a lot of preparation. You have to spend a lot of time. One of the big questions in FAANG companies that they'll ask you in your initial screening interview is going to be how much time do you spend coding? And they are expecting an answer that's similar to you spend almost 10 to 12 hours coding every day. They're looking for people that live and breathe coding. They want you to be really invested because for them, that's what they're looking for. They have the ability to look for that and hire people that are 100% obsessed with figuring out technical problems or figuring out business problems or just general interest in this industry because they pay the most, right? They have the best benefits. They offer you the best type of job, the best career acceleration. The company absolutely knows what it's offering. It absolutely knows that if you put Google on your resume, if you've worked there, your life is set. You will never have to worry about getting another job in this industry ever again. So they know what they're bringing to the table. So they are absolutely going to expect you to bring everything else to the table as well. Now, again, it seems very daunting, but that is what it is. I don't want to sugarcoat it. But with FAANG companies, that's what you need to bring to the table. So with the HR process, as I mentioned, a lot of the times inside for these companies, it's timing. They need to fill a role. They need to hire. They have business requirements to hit. And for them, they will hire somebody that may not be exactly what they're looking for because they just have to hire. They work on the fiscal year and they have different specific requirements for the HR department than for the tech department. The tech department might complain that they need another developer or 2 or 3 because they can't handle the workload. The HR then gets trickled down and told what they need to hire. Maybe the tech lead or the engineering manager of that team will speak to the HR person to figure out kind of what it is that they're looking for, but the HR person has to fill the role. So they might ask, how flexible are you on having 1 or 2 years experience? How flexible are you with them having PHP experience? How flexible are you on terms of what language or what frameworks they know? Chances are, if they haven't been able to fill the role for 2 months, then they're just going to loosen and be much more lax about what they're looking for. So these are the kind of things that you kind of have to see as something that you can't really anticipate, but you kind of just got to apply as much as you can. There are certain time periods where it's hard to apply, such as at the end of the year or at the end of quarters. The reason why we say at the end of different fiscal quarters it's hard to apply is because they might not be looking for, they might not just have the budget. They might have already hired and they're waiting until the next quarter or the next fiscal year in order to get the new hiring budget so that they can increase headcount. These are the kind of things in enterprise, and that's why it's a numbers game. Don't see it as always just that I've applied so many companies and none of them are getting back to me. It might just be that the timing is outside of your control. But you got to remember, with this HR process, it's a big numbers game. There's many different tools that you can leverage, right? You can try and apply to as many of the online websites that, like, recruiters might see as possible. You might try to apply through Glassdoor, which is actually a great website that shows you which companies are hiring. Maybe even careers.com, Indeed. Maybe you have a local job board somewhere online on a local website that you can use depending on your region. A lot of it is just going to depend on how you find a way for you to put yourself in front of somebody that is hiring. And a lot of that is just going to be about hitting the ground, right? You might have to go to meetups, a lot of meetups, and just try and see who's hiring, talk to them, give them your resume, or at least try and strike a conversation, show that you're interested, show that you're a little bit different, show that you're ambitious. And hopefully that's enough to convert them into at least being able to get that conversation going. Because with this HR process, they're kind of like the buyer in a weird way, and you're the seller. You're trying to sell them you, which is your product. And with sales, it's always a numbers game, right? Not everybody wants what you're selling, but out there somebody does, and it's just about getting yourself in front of that person. And with the HR process, as I mentioned, a lot of it is timing. Even with FAANG, it's timing, right? With the FAANG companies, the HR process is very rigorous. As I mentioned, it's very difficult to get even the first interview if you don't have a recommendation. But let's talk a little bit about the HR process with FAANG. With these big FAANG companies, they are looking for candidates that are going to be generalists. So what they're looking for is they're looking for people that can prove that they are going to be good at anything. They don't necessarily, you might be applying for a software engineer front-end role, so it might be a front-end specific role, but they're still going to test you like you have general knowledge. Don't expect the interview to have much front-end related things at all. In fact, they're just going to try and filter you out regardless with still a data structures and algorithms interview. And the reason for that is because they want to be able to swap you between any team inside that they are able to, which means that you got to be able to prove that you are flexible and smart and knowledgeable of the technical challenges. Now, is this to say that you're going to use data structures and algorithms in your job? Probably not. But the thing is that it's like any kind of standardized test. It's really what being good at data structures and algorithms shows, which is that you put in the time, you're able to communicate your solutions, and you're able to problem solve dynamically. So if you've never seen a data structures or algorithm interview question before, they're almost like technical riddles that involve the usage of these special types of data structures, kind of like whether it be arrays, graphs, binary trees, heaps, right? It's pretty varied in terms of it's an entire category of technical programming. It overlaps a lot with competitive programming. So if that sounds like something that you don't really know, then that's something, if you really want to apply for FAANG companies, that's something you absolutely must learn. So we talked about the HR process. Now, before I move on to I got the job, what's next, where we talk about, what do we do in the job, I want to talk about another category of job, which is remote. A lot of students actually asked me about remote companies. And actually a couple students also asked me about starting freelancing early on. So I'm going to talk about those two things. When it comes to remote jobs are going to be hard to get because, again, what remote job offers is something that a lot of people want. There's a lot of demand there. The freedom to work from home or work from anywhere around the world while being paid perhaps in a US salary or even another country that pays a higher salary than your living expenses or whatever salary that gets paid in your local region. That's something that a lot of companies know that they are offering with remote. So they are going to be much more stringent and much more demanding in terms of what they are looking for. They may demand that you absolutely have experience in certain frameworks. They may also look that you have very, very solid communication as well as teamwork experience. So a lot of what they're looking for is that they need to see that you're able to unblock yourself, whatever means possible, whether it be communicating to somebody that has context, whether it be being able to be active on Slack or some kind of messaging system, whether or not that you're able to very clearly and succinctly explain the problem that you're having or articulate a solution very clearly. These are all things that they're going to be looking for. Now, even amongst remote companies, there are these 3 different types. Now, when it comes to FAANG, there are FAANG remote opportunities. There are also companies that are very large and technical and, worth over $1 billion, which kind of groups them into this category a little bit in the sense that they're tech-first, big enterprise companies. Automatic is one. Automatic is the one that makes WordPress. They're pretty much all remote, right? GitHub is another one, largely remote. InVision is another one, which is a company that creates a frameworking software. A wireframing software for designers. That one is also quite remote. With remote work, the big thing that you may have to accept is that you probably need a lot of solid experience first before you're able to properly get a remote job. Trying to get a remote job right off the gate is quite difficult. Now, that's not to say that a lot of these startup companies are not looking for remote companies, especially if you're outside of the United States. Chances are you might actually be able to get a remote contract or a remote position for a small startups because the area you live in might be cheaper than for them to get a worker in their area. Because for startups, a lot of it is just that they have a limited budget and they're trying to work with it. Now, getting those jobs is mostly going to be the same thing. You have to prove that you can communicate, you have to prove that you know what you're going to do, and that you're going to be able to develop pretty independently. If you're a junior working for a startup, that's remote, that honestly may not be the best thing for you. If you're somebody who has the confidence to know that like any problem that gets put in front of you, you will probably figure it out and not, lose your sanity while doing so, then that is probably something that might be good for you. But understand that with remote companies, it tends to be a lot more difficult because with that freedom of being able to live anywhere, work anywhere, it comes with a trade-off where you will be expected to contribute independently. You will be expected to figure things out on your own because that's largely what they're paying you for. And the other thing is going to be, after we talk about this remote topic, is starting your own freelancing gig or, building your own company of that sort. So when it comes to building your own company, the problem with starting out that way is that you will probably experience a lot of, I want to say, how do I phrase this? You're going to have to prove to clients that you're able to do the job. And oftentimes for them, they're probably going to be making the trade-off that if you don't have that much work experience, then your cost has to be really low. If your cost is really low, it's going to be a matter of you convincing them that you can do the job and then them taking the risk with you. But the thing to keep in mind is that with a lot of these clients that you'll probably get, if they know tech, they probably know that they should not be contracting to you freelance-wise, just because you just don't have enough experience to maybe tackle all of these problems in an optimal way. If you go for a client that is non-technical and still trying to hire for a freelancer, chances are they don't really know the process, and they're going to be demanding. They're going to pay up, and they're going to require you to hit deadlines. They're going to require you to build things that, maybe weren't initially in the scope. They might be unhappy, not good at communicating what they're looking for. You're going to go through a lot of those initial headache problems when it comes to working freelance with not much experience. Because a lot of the times, by not having that much experience, the type of clients that you'll attract are going to be the type of clients that don't really know much about the tech process. They don't know much about building applications. And that's going to be a very big headache. But for some people, they're totally okay with that. That's a stress that they can handle. If that's the stress that you feel like you can handle and you're willing to give it a try, then absolutely. There's probably some business things that you're going to have to figure out, such as how to market yourself, how to get yourself those clients in the first place, how to pay your taxes in your region or country, right? There's going to be some of those business things that you have to figure out. On the other end, from a technical standpoint, it's going to be a big learning process where you're going to deal with a lot of the problems when it comes to running your own business, even from a freelance or a technical perspective. One is figuring out when to get them to pay. When do you deliver a certain amount of code, and then, how do you review it with them? If they want changes, how do you charge for that? You got to figure that all out in the initial contract. So there's a lot of the legal there that you got to figure out as well. Generally speaking, there's going to be a lot of these business-related things when it comes to doing freelance that you'll have to go through. If you find a good company, chances are you might actually be able to go through that pretty easily. But if not, then that's the kind of struggle that you're probably going to go through with freelance. So after those, let's jump back to what we were talking about before. Now, we've discussed all these different types of companies, all these different strategies for getting into them, kind of what it means to go through the interview process with them. And let's say you finally get the offer. So you're at the point right now where you got a job offer. Every job offer tends to be different in their own way, in the sense that you are probably going to be given a number for what your salary will be. With this, it's up to you whether or not you want to negotiate. I would suggest you always negotiate, but I understand if you're new to the industry and you just want to get in, you'll take whatever they're willing to give you. And that's perfectly fine. I did the same thing when I started. I actually took a free internship first that then became part-time and then finally became full-time, just because I just wanted to get into the industry. But knowing what I know now about the HR hiring process is that the moment a company is willing to offer you a job, that also means that they want you now. They've validated that you're good enough for what they're looking for. So that also means that they've spent resources and they've spent time into bringing you on board, because the process of hiring you, bringing you in, all that stuff, right? They're paying money to do so because the person that's in HR is spending time to do so, time that could have been spent somewhere else. When it comes to that means that it's a sunk cost already for them. They've already invested a certain amount of money and they're at the end now. If they can bring you in because, let's say you ask for let's just use an arbitrary number. Let's say they offer you $40,000 and you want $43,000 or $45,000. Then that means that if they lose you because they weren't willing to pay that upfront, all of the money that they've invested so far is gone. And for a company that is pretty large, like Enterprise or FAANG, that money is pretty small. It's pretty minuscule for them. For startups, it might be a little different, but even then, the wiggle room might still be there. So those are things to consider when it comes to actually negotiating for the job. Now, again, largely it's up to you whether or not you actually want to negotiate. In another case, as I mentioned, that I went through, when I was going through my interview process, I had done all my technical rounds and I had not necessarily heard back from the company anymore. They didn't tell me I didn't get the job, and they didn't tell me whether I got the job. What I instead said was that, hey, let me just do an internship. Like I just want the experience. I just want the experience. So if I'm willing to work for free, if you're willing to just take me on and give me something so that I can learn it. And in that case, for them, it's much less of a cost to bring you on and they get work for free. Now, whether or not the quality of the work is there is a different thing, but a lot of times they're going to understand that as well. So keeping that in mind, that it might actually be a great avenue, is that if you get that conversation going and you feel like perhaps technically you weren't that strong, you can still get into the company by offering to do a free internship. So that's one avenue. Because at the very least, even if you do the free internship, you come out with experience. You come out with experience that said that you were able to do something in the job, which makes your next interview and getting that next job easier. Because as I mentioned, that first one is the hardest. You just need that one yes, and then we're golden. So what about working in the job? You're working in the job, you're coming into your first technical job for the very first time, and it's going to be very overwhelming because this is the first time. There's a lot of pressure that you feel internally, like you're not good enough, or that you don't really have experience with the tech stack, whatever it is. By this point, you should still congratulate yourself. You have crossed one of the hardest parts, which is just getting into the company. This part is going to be complicated because there's a lot of variance in what they're looking for. If they brought you on as a junior, they should realistically expect you to deliver what a junior can deliver. And this is going to be, actually, I'm going to talk and do a little tangent about what it means to be a junior. So this part is actually going to be, I'm going to draw a graph here for you. So imagine we had a graph. And at the bottom here is experience. And over here on the side is output. Now, what do I mean by output? Output is the ability to deliver features, the ability to finish story tickets, right? Story tickets if you work in an environment that runs Scrum. The main idea of output is how much code are you producing. Now, the bottom here is experience. This is years of experience that you have. When it comes to experience, right, and output, the relationship actually looks kind of like this. So when you're a junior developer, you are going to probably produce a lot of code, but it might not be good code. But you're going to produce a lot of code because you don't really know what the best practices are. You don't really know what the trade-offs to make are. You don't really even know what good, perfect code looks like in every situation. So the main thing that you bring to the table as a junior is going to be output. You're probably going to crush a lot of feature. You might not build them well. They might be very confusing to read, not scalable, but for a lot of companies, especially startups and enterprise that are trying to compete in a market, that's what they want. One of the students inside of the soft skills channel, Yuki, he or she, I'm not sure. I really don't want to make a mistake here. But they really mentioned that when it comes to companies, especially startups and enterprise, when they bring you on, they're looking for somebody that will just do the work. If it's great code and it's scalable, that's excellent. That's a great plus side. But at the same time, chances are they're trying to compete in a market. They're trying to capture their business. They're trying to prove that what their business is makes sense. And the only way they can do that is to get a product in the user's hands. There's going to be a mountain of features that they're trying to build. And a lot of the times for them, it's going to be very lean. They're probably thinking, let's just get something out, get some feedback on whether or not the feature is even what the customers want, before we even think about optimizing and writing optimal code. Now, if they have senior developers that already know it, and they're able to also produce that, then that's a great thing, right? But chances are they're not. So this is why enterprise and startup companies, most likely startup companies, are looking for this slice of junior developers, because they understand that juniors are just very eager. That's why I said you have to show that you're willing, you're eager, and you're just ambitious, because they want that output. They want that output, and they are expecting you to grow in the process. And the fact that you have this level of output is a good thing. Don't see it as a bad thing. Yes, you might be writing bad code, but a lot of the times, that's just part of what the startup is looking for anyways, right? Now, ironically, as you become more of an intermediate, this output curve slows down drastically. The reason for that is because as you become more and more aware of best practices, writing clean, extensible code, you came into this career with a strong sense of imposter syndrome because you didn't know if you were good enough as a coder. The problem is now, is what's happening is you are now looking to get, you're looking to kind of, you've attached your sense of self to the questions that you're answering. Because the questions that you're, or sorry, not the questions, but the code that you're producing. Because of the features that you're building and the code that you're writing is, now you understand what it's like to build a good one. You spend so much more time refining it. And this is what we call over-engineering. And this is kind of a process that anybody goes through, but we don't really know how long of a time period that's going to be. Some people stay intermediate for 10, 12 years. Some people break past it and go become seniors in like 3, 4, 5 years. The main thing for a lot of companies is that you kind of want to go through this period as fast as possible, because at the end of the day, the output is the most important thing. So let's talk about what it means to be a senior. As a senior, you are now fully independent and probably can lead a project. Different sizes require different levels of seniority, but the main thing is that you have the kind of confidence that you can figure out a problem, or you know where to ask to find the solutions when you don't know how to solve a problem. At the same time, you know how to make trade-offs and you fully understand what the business requires of you, which means that you're willing to write worse code if it means you're going to hit this output, which is why this output curve goes way up. Because now, as a senior, you're confident enough to know for yourself that it's not about the quality of the code being perfect, which makes you a senior. It's the fact that you know what you're doing. So keeping this in mind, this is one of the big things about juniors, intermediates, and seniors. Juniors, for these companies, as I mentioned, when you get the job, keeping this in mind, a company should not expect a junior to know everything. They should actually expect you to need a lot of guidance. Juniors generally should not be left alone with a lot of code because it's a much bigger headache for them later on. Now, for startup companies, this might not be something that that happens. Maybe the culture is in such a way that it demands a lot from you. They want a lot of code production out of you. And if that's the case, then, at the end of the day, you kind of just have to deal with it, even though the expectation, honestly, is unrealistic from the company. But because what you're giving up, which is probably some of your mental sanity, though, is that you are growing very fast. You're constantly being thrown into the fire, and if you make it out of it, even if you produced code that was not optimal, and maybe you got hashed out by your boss about it, at the end of the day, you had the chance to build something live, right, on somebody else's dime. And oftentimes when companies take on juniors, that's what they're getting. That's really what they should expect that they're getting if they put them in that circumstance. What a good startup company culture, or what a good company culture is when it comes to hiring juniors, is that they know that what the junior brings to the table is output, the ambition, and the willingness to learn. If they are able to guide that and give you a culture where you want to stay, then they've suddenly now molded this new developer that really understands their system and their product and grew with the company. And now, because you maybe are attached to the company and the people that were willing to give you that first chance, then that's the big thing. That's the great thing for them. That's really what the best case scenario for them is, that you're willing to stay and help them push through the business, the market that they're trying to capture. Maybe you'll leave, but at the end of the day, they were able to get somebody that produced code and help them push the business along. But if a boss expects a junior to be doing work that is independent, maybe, honestly, let's take more concrete examples. If they take on a junior and expect them to be able to build a React app that is extensible, that is fully optimized, that has TypeScript integration, that has tests written, honestly, that's extremely, extremely unrealistic. It's just something that doesn't make sense. As a junior, there's so much experience that you're lacking that if you're doing it for the first time, you're bound to make mistakes, even if you watch tutorials online, because so much of what tutorials show is not going to be what you do on the job. And not to mention that we're not even talking about the fact that the scope changes and that in the company requires you to build on top of things, right? They might ask you for one thing and give you requirements and then suddenly change them next week, which means that suddenly you have to take this code you've already written and adjust it. Maybe you're working on old legacy code that is really hard to extend for the first place. Maybe the legacy code doesn't have best practices in place. There's a lot of these kind of problems that is just completely unrealistic for a junior to be able to solve. And a lot of the time, that slog that you're going through in the beginning is going to just be part of what it means to get that first year's experience. So keeping that in mind, ways that you can succeed in this environment, though, is that you got to ask a lot of questions. You got to not be afraid of asking a lot of questions, because the company should be invested in your learning, especially if you're junior. A company that is not invested in your career growth doesn't understand what it meant to hire a junior. You need to go against your instinct of feeling like you don't want to show that you don't know what you're doing. Because chances are, if the company is good and they understand that they brought on a junior, they're expecting you to ask questions. They're actually probably waiting for you to do so, and they ought to take the time to teach you certain things about how they build their website. Because, as I mentioned, they're outputting a lot, and probably the code quality is not that good. That means that they've made a lot of shortcuts, or maybe they've done stuff that is not optimal, that for a junior, there's no way that they can probably even figure out that certain corners were cut. You need somebody who has knowledge of the code base, like a more senior developer, to come in and help guide you. You need them to come in and help you understand what it is that you're looking at, what trade-offs they made. Because there's so many parts to an application that might change based on the needs of what it was that they were trying to do. There's a lot of hacks that might have been written. A lot of the code might even be spaghetti. If that's the case, you want to figure out if that's something that somebody in the company knows. If people don't know, then that's a thing that you need to put on the table and say that I actually don't even know how this works, and nobody in the company seems to have an idea about how this part of the app works. Should we work on something else? A lot of what you can bring as a junior that you may not have in terms of the experience technically is that you're able to, at the very least, communicate what you're able to do and what you're not able to do, and you're asking them to make the decision in terms of what they want you to focus on. If there's a part of the application that is critical and has a lot of complexity to it, then you need to be able to come to somebody early on and say, this is very complicated. I don't really know how to do this. Can somebody help me at least understand this system? Or what do I do when it comes to figuring this out if nobody in the company is able to do this? Can I just work on something else, right? How critical is this when nobody really knows? Should we bring in maybe more people to work on this problem? And honestly, if your culture is in such a way that, the boss just doesn't, demands that you not do this, doesn't like you asking questions or whatever, then you got to question the competency of the leadership. You got to question the competency of the company. You got to question whether or not you actually want to spend another year here. Because while it's very important for you to get experience, honestly, the impression and the experience you have in the years that you are in this industry really shape you and your perspective. Your time is still incredibly valuable. A lot of you will end up going to these big companies at some point in your careers. You right now may feel like you don't have much to offer, but I promise you that you will be good enough for a lot of these companies. A lot of it is just time and experience. So if that's the case, then you want to get the best time and experience. If that's what you want to get, then maybe you really got to think about whether or not the environment that you're working at is worth it for you. That's one of the hardest decisions to make when you're new, because there's so much anxiety and so much internal conflict about, blaming yourself and thinking that you're not good enough. But I'm telling you that honestly, you're a junior, right? Their expectations of you should be in line with what it is that you are. That's the big thing, right? And the growth that you'll get can be astronomical if you get in the right company. If they guide you the right way, if the right senior developer or developers or the team are willing to promote and figure out how to help you grow, you will jump from junior to intermediate to senior very, very quickly. You just need the right guidance. And a lot of that just happens to be whether or not you happen to be in the right company. And that can be in all of these companies. A lot of the times with these smaller startups, they have a great workplace culture, but they don't know how to communicate that because a lot of developers are aiming for enterprise and aiming for FAANG. You can get a great initial first year or two out of a startup. Maybe the startup has a really senior tech lead who understands, one, what it means to be a tech lead and help promote the growth of juniors and help to promote the growth of intermediates. But at the same time, they also were compelled by the company's mission and the vision, and that's why they're working on this product. So that's the big thing. I think it's very important for you to figure out also in your first year how much it is that you have to learn and how much of it is that the company is right for you. So that's kind of the long-winded, complicated answer about I got the first job, what's next, right? Afterwards, you kind of go through that same process again when it comes to going into different companies. But that's the thing, right? You just want to go to a lot of meetups. You want to put yourself in front of, a lot of hiring managers, however you can. Check LinkedIn, check Twitter, right? Put out messages, follow people. A lot of the times, a lot of people in the industry, in your local community, are probably going to try and push out a message that so-and-so is hiring or this person is hiring. And, DM people, reach out on LinkedIn, reach out on Twitter, just ask questions. The worst case is nobody responds, right? And honestly, you miss all the shots that you don't take. If you send out a message and they don't respond, right? Don't take it personally. Just move on and just keep going. Just understand it's a numbers game. So with that, let's talk. We also actually talked about workplace culture and imposter syndrome as well. So with that, we've talked actually about probably this is going to be roughly your first year or two in the software industry. So with these things in mind, I endeavor everybody to apply, right? Apply to as many jobs as you can. Honestly, this imposter syndrome thing kind of doesn't really go away with that much time, right? You probably are going to feel that for a long time. This might actually go into the question, which is, how do I know when I'm a junior, or how do I know when I'm an intermediate? How do I know when I'm a senior? That question is a little hard to answer because you kind of just figure it out, like and a lot of the times it depends on what company you work for. If you work for a smart startup or an enterprise that doesn't really have scale, you might be able to solve all of the problems, right, that they have. And in your mind, you're like, hey, I'm able to take on features, build them in a productive amount of time. I was able to build them much better than I was last year, or I was able to build them better than any of my peers. I feel like I'm this most senior developer in this company. If that's the case, you could go to another company and realize that the scope of the problems you've never even seen before. And to that company, you might be an intermediate or you might be a junior. The big things about intermediates is that intermediates have independence in the sense that they're able to take a feature, like let's say they need to build the header, or they need to build the dropdown, or they need to build a pricing page, or they need to build a modal. Whatever it is, if they're able to handle it on their own with some guidance, right, when it comes to things that aren't really, outside of their scope, but generally speaking, they have a good idea of how to figure it out, and they code it in a way that's pretty extensible, pretty scalable, then you are a intermediate at that point. You're an intermediate when you're pretty much independent, when people know that you're able to not only be independent, but possibly even make some improvements, right? You are able to evaluate trade-offs properly. You're an intermediate. When you're a senior is when you're able to lead the project. when you are certain about how to lead the project, you have some experience about how to code the problem. And generally speaking, if you're looking at everybody else and everybody else looks to you for what to do, and you're able to actually help them and build the product, solve the technical problems, make the trade-offs, and then those decisions prove to work out, you're a senior. The seniority thing really kind of comes, interestingly, from your peers as well. You kind of need that external validation that you are senior. You need people to treat you as a senior, because it is hard. It's very arbitrary. It's kind of abstract in a lot of ways. But that's the big thing about seniority, right? Is that you're independent, you know what trade-offs to make, you know what decisions to make for an application, and you make them correctly. Or at least like 80, 90% correctly. Or even if you make it the wrong decision, you knew the risk. The big thing about being senior is that you know the risks that you're taking by following down this decision. Chances are you're also able to very quickly figure out what kind of architecture is needed in order to move forward. You're able to build it in and solve the problems that the rest of your team probably either doesn't know how to solve or doesn't know how to solve efficiently. Oh, hold on. I think my stream might have cut out. No. Guys, am I still live, everybody? I just want to make sure. Hello? Am I still, I think there's a bit of a delay, so if anybody can tell me. Okay. Okay, cool. So yes, when it comes to seniority, that's kind of what it means. So let me answer some of the other questions that a lot of some students have asked me. One is about salary and figuring out how much salary you are supposed to make. So it's very regional, and it depends on which country you're in. It depends even on what city you are in. So one way to figure out is try and see what the job posting websites in your localized region are, and see how much their base salary for a junior will be. The other way is to talk to other developers in your community and just ask. Honestly, you just got to ask, what's the expected salary range inside of my region, right? Unfortunately, much of my knowledge is all on Toronto and San Francisco. So that's kind of like difficult for me to answer specifically, but the way that I would go about figuring it out is I would, go to a meetup and just tell people, hey, I'm new to this area, or I'm new to this industry. I'm just trying to get a better idea of kind of like, how much money can people make as a junior? How much money can people make as an intermediate? How much money can people make as a senior? So that's kind of like the thing. Honestly, like with salary, it's a little bit of a hard topic to tackle, because everything is so dependent also on the demand, right? It varies a lot. If your city has a big tech scene and there's a lot of developers and there's a lot of tech companies, then it's really competitive, right? It becomes a market for developers. But if you're in a city that doesn't have that many developers or that many tech companies, then the demand is not really there, and it's not really a developer market. It becomes a company market, and they kind of really get to maybe like, lowball what they'll offer you, just because it's not like they have much competition. So keeping that in mind, that's kind of like my advice is go out there, try and talk to other developers, get an idea of kind of like what salary people are paying. And when you talk to recruiters, also when they ask you for a figure, you can even just say outright, I don't really know, if you can't figure any of that out. So what do you think is fair? Now, whether or not that is a good strategy depends on where you are. Some places might try and immediately, think, oh, let's just take advantage of this person. So honestly, a lot of that is going to be, what it's going to like in terms of that. If I gave an example of Toronto, for example, juniors in Toronto make anywhere from 40 to 80,000, and a lot of it will come down to negotiation, whether or not you get higher on the higher end or even higher than that. Intermediates can make anywhere from 80 to 110-ish, depending on the company and the placement, and then seniors can make 110 to 150 plus, up to upwards like even 180, 200,000, right? This is Canadian, of course. This is in Canadian dollars. Keeping that in mind, one big thing to keep in mind as well is that startups will pay less. They probably tend to pay less because they just don't have the budget. Enterprise pays a little bit more, but they're not going to pay the astronomical numbers, just because enterprise doesn't have to. They don't really need people that are that technically talented, and if they do, they only need like one or two, right? And then of course FAANG companies pay the most. They pay astronomical. They by far are like 40, 50, 60, 100% higher than the average. In San Francisco, for example, senior Facebook developers or senior Google developers, when it comes to the total compensation, which includes stock options and benefits, whatever, right? You can make, like if you're like an L7 or an L8, you can make 500,000 plus USD. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. Now, some of the questions are also around, now, what do I learn? I'm seeing some of the discussion right now about how do I, stop doing tutorials? When do I feel more confident? Honestly, when you're a junior, it's really hard to kind of do that on your own because you kind of need a reason to be coding something every day and getting that experience. So one big thing to keep in mind is going to be that you should probably try and contribute to a code base that has somewhat of a production style, right? Like a website, like a company standard. Open source is oftentimes very good for that. One thing that you can contribute might not even be code. You might just contribute to the documentation, because that at least means that you've read their code and you look at their documentation and you are able to see that the documentation is not as accurate as what the code is saying it does, right? That will at least show that you're able to read code, you're willing to contribute. Another thing is that you're able to also, be willing to be proactive and contribute to the community. That's another sign that shows that you have some experience and expertise. Honestly, with the tutorials thing, a lot of coding is just about documentation. You just always go back to documentation. If you feel like you don't really know what you're doing when it comes to building a React application, honestly, that's very okay, because as a junior, it's not expected that you understand all the parts of how to build a React application. It's very complicated because every piece of it is meant to solve a different problem, right? Like, a lot of these concepts are very challenging because when you're new, you don't even know what the solution is trying to solve. I think that's one of the biggest things about juniors and for juniors to figure and learn about themselves, is that when you look at a lot of the code and a lot of the frameworks and a lot of the best practices, these are solutions to long existing problems that have compounded for years and years and years. If you want to be able to figure out what the solution does, you have to understand the problem. But you might not even understand the problem because the solution exists and it's considered now the standard. This is where a senior developer is supposed to come in and be able to tell you, this is what this solution is for. This is what it's trying to fix. This is the problem that you'll encounter if you don't go with this solution. So this is one of the kind of things that you'll kind of experience. So keeping this in mind, let's see what other questions. So when it comes to evaluating technology, honestly, as a junior, you should probably figure out what the easiest way to get a job would be, if you want to stay, in your area, or if you want to go to another city or another country even, you should figure out kind of what technology is popular there. So if you're trying to code on the front end, the most popular is going to be React, Angular, Vue. Because chances are with startups, they probably are building new applications. They're probably companies that have been around for 1 or 2 years, and they probably picked one of these frameworks because it's the most supported. So if that's the case, you should probably try and learn at least enough of that language or framework to be able to go in and say, hey, I've got some experience, right? It doesn't have to be a lot of experience. It can just be, I kind of know what it does. When it comes to back-end stuff, it's a little bit more complicated because it'll depend on the stack. You can do Python. You can also do Node. Node is actually very beneficial for full stack because chances are, every website that has full stack means it has a front end. And if it has a front end, it means that it's JavaScript. And even if you do Node and your experience with Node isn't what they have as their backend system, you still show that you have experience with JavaScript, which means that you can do the front end portion of it. So it's better to kind of hit that box. When it comes to the complexity of learning new technologies, like a lot of the new stuff, GraphQL, honestly, if you're just conversational in it, you don't have to be that technically skilled in it to be able to get a job. I think even if they run GraphQL as the backend system, honestly, because you are new to the industry, I think honestly a lot of it is also managing your own expectations. Like, I think that expecting yourself to know everything and calm that voice of your imposter syndrome is also unrealistic, because if that were the case, you would be an intermediate or a senior and not a junior. And if you're applying for a junior role and you are a junior, then that's, you just got to know what it is that you're bringing to the table, which is, again, the ambition, the willingness to learn, being proactive. So those are kind of the general idea here when it comes to technology, right? Just pick the one that gives you the highest chance of getting a job. Andre obviously does a great series, The Monthly Developer, where he talks about what technologies are worth learning, what's popular, and he has all the stats to back it up. As for a CS degree in Canada, absolutely not. I worked in Canada for 5 or 4-ish years without a CS degree. I have a degree in political science and philosophy. And I work for some of the biggest tech companies in Toronto. And all of it is just, honestly, once you get that first job, it's very easy to get the next one. So with the CS degree and whatnot, that's kind of where it lands. So okay, let me field a question to everyone in the stream. Do you want me to talk more about breaking into the FAANG industries, or what would you like me to talk about? Let me give some options. Maybe it's easier, so then that way not everyone is rushing and writing all these different questions. But do you want me to talk more about how to get into a Google interview, or maybe how do you transition into a different role in a company? Like if you're in development but you want to be a product manager or a product owner or something like that. Okay. So you know what? There's seems to be not that many responses, but I'll talk about FAANG and I'll talk about the question about tutorial heaven. Funny. Okay, so with the tutorial one is easy. Honestly, you just got to do it quickly. The tutorial heaven one is, I mean, you use tutorials as a tool, right? Tutorials, blogs, courses, whatever they are meant to be a tool to help you quickly understand the basics of some new language. If that's the case, then what you're trying to use them for is to learn the basics of the language. That tool is going to be useful to you perhaps throughout your whole career, because it's like a reference or something. And if you want to be able to build something on your own, a lot of it might just be using those tutorials while you build this thing and then doing it over and over again until you have an idea of, what it is that this tool is trying to do for you. If you find yourself keep relying on tutorials in a way where you feel like you're not growing, it might be that you don't really understand what it is that this tool that you're using is trying to do. So, with that in mind, it's not that concrete. When the tutorial phase ends, it's kind of different for everybody. I don't think you should just see it as I'm doing these tutorials, therefore I'm not good enough to work. I don't think you can really work on that in that sense. Okay, so sorry, I just had to look for something quickly. So let's talk about transitioning to a different role. I know a couple people have talked about that. Okay, so when it comes to transitioning, it depends on the company, honestly. Enterprise, startups, and FAANG are different. If you're already in the company and you want to transition, you just have to speak to your manager and tell them that this is kind of the path I want to go in. Is there any overlap inside of the company that will allow me to do this? When it comes to that, all of it will come down to whether or not the company allows for that kind of transition to happen. If you are trying to do it without the company, let's say you're in a company that doesn't allow that transition, then you're going to have to spend some of your free time outside of work trying to build the experience and show that you're able to, maybe jump that role. Let's say, for example, you're trying to go from a developer to a designer, then chances are you're going to have to show that you have some design work, whatever it is, even in your own side of things. If you're trying to become a product manager or a product owner, that's really difficult without experience, because product management is something that you kind of get into once you're in a company. They very rarely hire junior product managers kind of out of nowhere unless they have some kind of overlapping attributes or skills, like they've done some management in some kind of way. So that's something that kind of, really depends, right, on what role you're trying to transition from. It might be a little easier going from development to design. And if that's the case, if you're going from development to design, you kind of just have to figure out, if you're in a startup, it's probably easier to do because in a startup, you're expected to wear many hats anyways. You just have to see whether or not your manager feels like you can do your work that you're, expected to as a developer, and then, do any design work on top of that. It's up to them in terms of what they want to prioritize. So that's the thing with transitioning roles. Honestly, the easiest way is to be in a company that allows that transition, and you can work with your manager to figure out a transition plan. I've seen a couple people do it before, but I myself have never done it that way. I've only basing this off of kind of the experience and exposure that I've seen. I've seen people go from QA to Scrum Master, but honestly, that's one thing about it. Now, let's talk about FAANG, because I saw a lot of interest in FAANG. So, preparation for FAANG is going to be extensive. You have to learn data structures and algorithms, because that's just going to be what they want you to know. That's what they're going to test you on. The only way to learn data structures and algorithms, and even if you learned it and let's say you have a CS degree, you're still going to have to brush up on it. And there are resources and tools online that you can use to learn them. Andre has a great course on introducing you to data structures and algorithms called Mastering the Coding Interview. But if you're going for FAANG, they're going to expect a lot more in the sense that they're going to want you to have a very deep knowledge of all of them and how to apply them to the technical questions. So, for example, let's say you're trying to learn data structures and algorithms for the first time. There are 3 tools that I would suggest you use. The first is I would get the book Cracking the Coding Interview. Cracking the Coding Interview is very popular because it is kind of the only book that really has been written from somebody who worked in hiring across all the big FAANG interviews. That's the big thing with FAANG. So outside of Cracking the Coding Interview, I would actually watch, there's a great YouTube series on data structures and algorithms by a developer on YouTube called Abdul Bari. He has a video playlist called Algorithms, and that one is very high level. It's high level, and he explains a lot of these technical concepts, like these data structures, in a very easy to understand way. But even with these resources, there's a lot of practice you have to do. You can either use HackerRank, you can use Geek for Geeks, you can use LeetCode. You just have to see these problems because a lot of these problems are pretty hard. Like, there are going to be things that you don't really do in your day-to-day job, and a lot of them is based on space and time optimization, meaning how time optimized is the algorithm you're writing when it comes to a algorithm. When I say algorithm, what I mean is that the kind of questions you'll get a question that might ask you, let me write one out actually, just so that you get an idea of kind of what kind of questions you'll get. There's many categories of questions too. And I'll pick actually one that's kind of in the middle. It'll probably be very confusing for a lot of students, just because honestly, like you need, it's good for you to kind of see how hard these questions might be. But let's say you had a chessboard. And let's say this chessboard is a size n by n. Now, when I say n by n, n is just a number, right? So and you don't know what n will be, your algorithm has to be flexible, meaning that if the question, or let's say like when they run your algorithm, they pass in an n of 5, 6, 8, or 10, your algorithm still needs to be efficient enough to solve the problem. Now, let's say you have inside of this chessboard of n by n, let's say our n right now is 5. Let's say in the middle you have a knight, like a chess piece of a knight. The knight is able to move in 4 places. It always goes up, up, left, right, up, right, this way, 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 and this way. So yeah, if you guys are familiar with chess, this is something that you'll know, which is that the way that a knight moves is it goes up 2 and then left 1, or it goes, straight in one direction 2 and then up or down 1, right, in the perpendicular direction. So the question will be, let's say you get also some k value, k being another number that could be anywhere from 1 up till, let's say, like 300. What this question is asking is that based on some value of k and some value of n, if our knight always starts in the center, what is the chance that after k steps, this knight is off the chessboard? So this means that, let's say the first time this knight moves here, if k is 5 as well, that means that this knight on the first step has a 1 in 8 chance to step on any of these. But then let's say it stepped here on step 1. It then has to you have to figure out, based on the pattern that it's able to walk, what is the chance it's going to stay on the board, and what's the chance it's going to fall off the board. And then you got to do that for 5 different steps, meaning that from here, the chances that it stays on the board, and then it stays on the board again, and then it stays on the board again, and then it stays on the board again. Keeping in mind all of those things, how is all of that going to fit into the algorithm that you're going to write, and then how are you going to make that time optimized? Right? Like, these types of questions are the kind of questions that is very hard to solve if you have no idea about data structures and algorithms. It is honestly something that is one where you got to spend a lot of time trying to solve. And this problem isn't even one of the hard problems. This is actually one of the medium problems. And even learning data structures and algorithms, that process takes a long time for you to be able to figure out this problem independently. This is just like kind of an idea of what it takes in order for you to learn what it is to get into these FAANG companies, right? So not only is it difficult for you to get the interview for a FAANG company, because as I mentioned, if you're going organically, if you just apply, you really only have a 3% chance, unless you've already worked in one before. Alternatively, the other hard thing is that these questions, if you're just coding and you're just doing like development work, you probably don't really know how to solve this problem, because a lot of the techniques and a lot of the data structures you just don't really know how to use in a day-to-day setting. Like, where would this ever really appear in a live application? But the thing is that what they're trying to test you at a FAANG company is based on a scaling input and based on different constraints. What is the most optimal way for you to come up with the correct solution? They're not just trying to see whether or not you can come up with the correct solution. They're trying to see whether or not you can optimize it, whether or not you can communicate in the interview a solution of how to solve this. Because there are thousands of these types of problems, and they're all very confusing. But the thing is that you have to try and figure out how to utilize the data structures and the algorithms live while you're problem solving and figuring out. Because there's always kind of like some kind of technical trick to these questions that you have to be able to identify. And I say it's a technical trick because it's kind of like a riddle. It's not very obvious the first time when you're looking at it. So this is just one of those things that you kind of have to practice. So honestly, for everybody trying to go for FAANG, I suggest that you take the time to really figure out what is required in that interview, because it's very extensive. And one big thing is probably just keep studying and try and figure out if you know anybody in these companies that are willing to give you a recommendation. Otherwise, just keep applying. In FAANG, their interviews are, honestly, they're very challenging because the full breadth of understanding is required. Not only do you have to know graphs, you have to know some of the more optimized ways of applying some of the algorithms from graphs, right? So maybe you got to apply Dijkstra, right? Dijkstra's algorithm to a problem. You got to be able to look at the problem, where the problem might be something like this. Now, this is not a graph problem. This is a dynamic programming problem. But you got to be able to see it and just be able to make that connection. Hey, I got to apply this slightly nuanced formula in order for this to be optimized. So this is one thing to keep in mind. When it comes to the actual interview, like, I guess digging deeper into the interview process, chances are if you're new, if you're a junior and you're going for an L3, you're not going to get system design or product design. If you are L4 or higher, meaning that you've got a couple years of experience, then you will be expected to do system design. And system design is very, honestly, it's one of those things where you kind of have to have experience for it. You can study it, and there's some great resources out there that give you a high-level idea, but much of system design is going to be about them trying to figure out if you are able to make trade-offs and communicate clearly, as well as understand all of the high-level pieces of what goes into building a scalable system. System design interviews have nothing to do with front end. They almost all have to do with the back end setup. So this might be a question that they might ask is, can you design Twitter, right? If we were to build Twitter, how would we do it? So when it comes to that, though, they're looking for you to figure out and identify constraints, right? Like how many users are we going to have? What kind of core features are part of the Twitter universe, right? We need follows, right, between users. Do we want direct tweets? Do we want at tweets? Do we want, like what do you call it? I'm drawing a blank right now. Oh my god, the front page thing where it like all the latest tweets show up, whatever that thing is called. I'm completely drawing a blank right now. But you got to be able to first identify what features are required before you even start figuring out kind of the starting the system of like what that'll look like. So you might have to figure out like whether or not for your team constraints and the size of the people that are working on the product, is it going to be, do you need something like a monolith, or do you need something like a microsystem, right? Beyond that, where are you going to place load balancers? Where's the load going to be heavy when it comes to making these requests? What's the best request network to make these requests over? When it comes to the database, right? What do we do if our data, when we look at, we're storing millions, hundreds of millions of tweets every hour, right? How do we make sure that our database scales? How do we make sure that our servers don't go down, right? What's a slave-master relationship, and when is it required? If we're going to shard our database, what should we shard it off of? There's so many things of a system design interview that you'll have to study for and kind of like just get the exposure and experience for, that it's just one of those things where honestly, a lot of it is kind of just like you got to study, but also try and put yourself in a situation where you get that experience even a little bit. Because for them, with Google and with Facebook, with these FAANG interviewers, right? They know what they're looking for, and you either have it or you don't. So like that's one of those things, right? Like you definitely aspire for it, but just understand that because if you want it, you have to hit their expectation, and their expectations are very high. So that's kind of the big thing about FAANG. There's a lot of types of questions that you're going to get in FAANG. You just generally have to be prepared and have a wide enough breadth of knowledge of what you need to know when it comes to the technical. And you also have to know like how to approach a problem, communicate, and walk through it in such a way that you're able to accurately communicate a solution when you're in that live interview. Because the live interview is going to be, it's like 4 rounds of interviews. Each one is an hour. You're sitting with one engineer and they give you one of these problems and a whiteboard, and you have to kind of figure it out. You got to be able to solve that problem by writing it on a whiteboard and talking through your code and then optimizing it after, right? Maybe they'll throw a curveball at you. Like maybe they'll say, what if it's an M by M board, right? How does that change things? They'll figure out like different things where like maybe instead of the night starting in the very middle, the night starts. They also give you coordinates of where the night starts. There's all these different things that they might do to try and figure out if the code you wrote is adaptable and extensible enough. So honestly, like with FAANG interviews, a lot of it is just the study. Yeah. Let me see. Did I miss any questions? Sorry, let me just I'm just looking through some of these questions to see if I missed anything major. I think I've hit everything. If I haven't, I'm very sorry. I think like the big focus on today's topic was mostly just on, getting that first job, getting in there, right? Navigating kind of the industry, understanding how the HR works. And then like, what do you do about the first job? So that's the big thing. Keeping that in mind, yeah, I think that's everything for this stream. I'm definitely going to do this on a bi-weekly basis, but I'm also going to keep answering questions in the soft skills channel. So if there were any questions that I missed, right, please message me on there, and I'll answer them to, if you need it immediately. Otherwise, I can try, we'll keep doing this, and definitely give me any feedback on anything you kind of wish that I did differently for this stream, right? This is a first one, so I want it to be, a little bit more adaptable, try and kind of like, make this more useful to everybody in the community, especially when it comes to, getting their first job and navigating through your career path in this industry. Also, I think one big thing that I really want is that for students to feel like there's somebody that can give them advice, or give them just a perspective when you feel like you don't really know where you're going or how you're going to navigate all this stuff. But definitely, yeah, give me any feedback you guys have, and yes, I will definitely upload this video on YouTube. So yeah, no, thank you everybody for joining me on this stream. Again, I'm very grateful for everybody to allow me to do this. Yeah, thank you everyone.